I want to talk to you a little bit about diatonic chord progressions. So that means that I first of all need to define that term I just used, diatonic. What do I mean by diatonic? That is a word that we use in music to simply mean we are remaining inside of a key. That means we are going to establish that key, we're going to decide that we're going to be in that key. For example, I've written up here the chords that we find in C major. So if I'm going to be in C major, diatonic means I'm only going to use chords in my piece of music in C major that are found naturally within C major. Now, that may include, of course, as we know, any of the triads. Those are the triads, I've written them up there above the notes of C major, and it creates chords which we can label with Roman numerals this way, or we can actually give guitar chord names to up the top here. Both of those really mean essentially the same thing. The one chord shows that it is the chord built on the tonic note, and it is a C major chord. The one being capital means it's major. We understand all of that. So that, in a sense, what I've done there is I've said, as far as writing diatonically, I have given myself a series, a set of resources to use. And here they are. All of these chords are possible to be used in a diatonic piece in C major. Now, of course, music doesn't always stay in one key. I could change key, and then I would move diatonically to another key. And if I did that, then I would have a new set of chords in that key to use, for as long as I was in that key. Diatonic simply refers to being in a key and only using materials from that key to create your harmony and your melody and the other parts that create the essence of the music. Now, that's diatonic. The alternative is chromatic, and in a next series of videos we will talk about what happens if we have chromatic harmony. But for now we're dealing with diatonic harmony. So this is certainly one set of diatonic resources that we have that we can use if we are going to write music in the key of C major. Remember that we can also use the seventh chords. We can go ahead and add a seventh to any of these chords, and we could have seventh chords that could also be used. And because in adding a seventh, we're not changing anything in the key, all the notes we would add would also be notes from the key of C major. We're not adding any accidentals. That would also then create diatonic chords. They would be diatonic seventh chords that are found inside the key that we could use. So how do you put together progressions that involve these chords, these triads or these seventh chords? Well, essentially, here's the rule. The rule is there are no rules. I don't even like the term rules because it tends to suggest that there's certain ways to do it. And music is an art form, and creativity is a very anti-rule type thing. Creativity is about, in a sense, breaking the rules, you know, thinking outside of the box or outside of the lines, drawing outside of the lines, doing something a little different. So I don't like the idea that there are rules to music. However, there are, over the course of many years, there are certain chord groupings or chord progressions, as we call them, that have tended to come to the surface and tend to be more prevalent and more often used than others. There are some chord groupings or chord progressions that just don't seem to work as well. They don't seem to resonate as well with songwriting or with instrumental writing or with the human spirit when it hears those chord progressions. And so part of our job is to find out, well, what are the conventions, or what are the regular, normal, everyday practices, and can we kind of evolve from that some guidelines that would help us to know how to write diatonic chord progressions? Would there be something we could use that would help us with that? Well, there certainly are. And here are a few just simple things to keep in mind. First of all, you will use far more 1, 4, I should say 1, 5, and 4 chords, because that would be the true order in which you would use them. You will use these chords the most. If I were writing up a chart of most used chords, 1 would be on the top, 5 would come next, 4 would come next. If I were to then go on down the chart and write the other chords that would then be used, I might find, and it gets a little tricky at this point, but 2 and 6 are probably then used next most. 7 although it is not used often in rock and pop style, I would say it would be the next most used chord if you're looking at tonal music throughout the course of time. And the one used least, in fact, if I could do it, I would write it over there somewhere on the wall, off the board. The least often used chord is the 3 chord. That's not to say it is not used or it cannot be used, it's just not used that often. So if you decide to write a chord progression and it goes, let's say, 2, 7, 3, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 3, 3, you get the idea. If you start doing that, then you're probably going to find that your chord progression is going to be outside of the general guidelines for writing a chord progression that tends to work or tends to have been generally accepted as effective and workable over the course of time. It doesn't mean what you've written is wrong, it just means you're pushing the edge of what would normally be expected. That may be fine, you could do it, you could do it really well and can make it work, but it may not be conventionally what would normally happen. If instead you write a chord progression that uses 1 and 4 and 5 a lot, and then occasionally adds a couple of 2 and 6 chords, you're probably going to be in good shape. Another thing to bear in mind, some of these chords are very similar to others such that they can be used instead of. So you might have a chord progression where you could substitute one of these chords for one of the chords along here. For example, the 1 chord and the 6 chord kind of substitute for one another in certain instances. The 5 chord and the 5 chord and the 7 chord, my mistake, can kind of substitute for one another from time to time. And they can do that because there's a lot of overlap. In fact, if you add a 5 chord and a 7 chord and you combine them together, you actually end up with a 5-7 chord, that is to say a dominant 7 chord. If you think about that, if I take my 5 chord here, G, B, D, and my B, D, F chord, and I combine them together, well, the notes that are the same are B and D, so I would end up with G, B, D, F. So it stands to reason that these two chords are very closely interlinked because they actually create a very usable chord, the 5-7 chord, when you combine them together. The 4 chord and the 2 chord have a similar sense of substituting for one another. So that means you could have a chord progression that could work really, really well. It could go like this. 1, followed by 4, going to 5, going to 1. And you could say to yourself, that's great, I'm pretty sure that will work because it uses a lot of these chords. In fact, it only uses these chords. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a good progression, it's going to work. But then you can say, but I'd like it to be a bit more interesting, a bit more varied. So what might I do? I might say, well, I'll use the substitution for the 4 chord. I'll go 1, 2, 5, 1. Maybe that would work better. Maybe that would work, be as good, or another way of doing essentially the same thing. Certainly it would work. Another thing you can do with chord progressions is you can always decide you want to use some of the chords in inversions. So what if we did 1, 2, and this time we put it in first inversion? Well, that would also work well. So you can play with it a little bit to figure out. You don't have to have every chord in root position every time. And in fact, experimenting with some inversions can help to add real interest to your chord progressions. That's another way you can add interest. So one way, use chords which are commonly used more often. Another way, use progressions that are commonly used, but realize that you can substitute in other chords that often are substituted for one another. And those specifically are the 6 chord for the 1 chord, the 7 chord for the 5 chord, or the 2 chord for the 4 chord. And then another way that you can add interest to your chord progressions is to use inversions, to not have every chord in root position. So that's another way you can create diatonic chord progressions. But remember that while there are generally a set of progressions that have kind of emerged over time as being quite popular and often being used, there are no rules. You can have any chord follow any other chord, and you can have chords last for any length of time. what you will find is that fairly quickly you will start to put kind of boxes around yourself. You will fall into conventions. You will mimic and imitate other people that you've heard using certain chord progressions, and there's nothing wrong with that. I would encourage you to always remember, however, that there is no right or wrong or no rules. There are things that if you want to sound like certain other people, you're going to have to write in that way. You're going to have to use certain chords and in certain ways. But that doesn't mean you always have to do that. If you write with other chords in other ways, you will just be kind of pushing the bounds in a different direction. There's nothing wrong with that. What should guide you, however, is in a sense artistry and goal points. What is your point? What is your goal? Why are you putting these chord progressions together? What are you trying to communicate or to say? And have that in mind, and that may help you to make decisions about whether or not you want to use something that is more readily and easily identified and connected with, or whether you would want to use something that is a little bit more pushing the edge, a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more on the edge of what would normally be accepted. So, in summary, you have a set of resources in any given diatonic key. You can use any of these chords in any order, but you will generally find that there are some conventions that emerge. For example, if you're in a key, you normally start on the home chord, and you normally return to it at the end, although you don't have to, but you normally do. The guidelines would suggest that that's what you would do. There are certain chord progressions like 1-4-5-1 or 1-2-5-1. Another classic chord progression that we often come across is 1-6-4. I should mark it. Correct. 1-6-4-5-1. This is a classic chord progression that is often used. And there are many others. So just to bear in mind, you can certainly find some certain classic chord progressions that may work as well. But you, again, don't have to. So you have this set of resources. The goal now is to go away and just to play with them. To say to yourself, let me find whatever my instrument is and see if I can figure out a way to work with these chords to create progressions. Obviously, instruments that play chords, like guitars or pianos, they're a little bit easier to handle some of this with, but it's not impossible to think this through on other instruments as well. So start playing with these diatonic chords. Have a go at putting them together. See what you come up with. See if you can go to the web and look at pieces of music you like. You can find chord charts all over the web. Look at the chords that those particular composers use. Look at the chords that the songwriters you like use, and see if you can turn them into Roman numerals and start to identify patterns. Maybe you'll find that certain patterns emerge time and again, and that may clue you into certain progressions that might be more popular or more readily used or readily related to than others. So start looking at diatonic chord progressions and seeing if you can find places where you can identify chord progressions and start to create chord progressions of your own that are based on this set of chords and or the seventh chords that you can create over any given particular scale. Good luck with that. We'll talk about it more in class. Thank you.